Chapter 19. The 90/10 Riddle. I was working with a group of very bright graduate students at Thunderbird School of Global Management. During the 3-hour session, I asked one of the young students, "What is your investment plan?" Without hesitation, he replied, "When I graduate, I will find a job that pays me at least $150,000 a year and will put aside at least $20,000 a year to buy investments." I thanked him for his willingness to share his plan with me. Then I said, "Do you remember my discussion of Rich Dad's 90/10 principle of money?" "Yes," said the young man with a smile, knowing that I was about to challenge the way he was thinking. He was enrolled in the entrepreneurship program of this very prestigious school where I was a guest instructor. By now, he knew that my style of teaching is not to give students answers. My style is to challenge core beliefs and ask students to evaluate old thought patterns. "What does the 90/10 principle of money have to do with my investment plan?" he asked cautiously. "Everything," I replied. "Do you think your plan of finding a job and investing at least $20,000 a year will put you in the category of the 10% of investors who make 90% of the money?" "I don't know," he replied. "I never really thought about my plan with that benchmark in mind." "Most people don't," I replied. "Most people find an investment plan and think it is the only investment plan or the best investment plan, but few compare their plans to other plans. And the problem is that most people will not find out if their plan was the right plan until it's too late." "You mean the average investor is investing for retirement and will not find out if their plan worked or not until they retire?" asked another student in the class. "They'll find out when it is too late. For many people my age, that will be true," I replied. Sad, but true. "But isn't the idea of finding a high-paying job and putting $20,000 a year away a pretty good plan?" asked the student. "After all, I'm only 26 years old." "A very good plan," I replied. "Definitely putting away more money than the average person and starting young with that much money will probably make you a very rich man. But my question is, will your plan put you in the 90/10 league of investors?" "I don't know," said the young man. "What would you advise? Do you remember my telling you the story of walking along the beach with my rich dad at the age of 12? I asked. "You mean the story of you wondering how he could afford such an expensive piece of real estate?" Another student replied. "Rich Dad's first big investment and his first move into the world of bigger investments." I nodded my head and replied, "That's the story." "And that story has to do with the 90/10 rule of money?" asked the student. "Yes, it does. It applies because I always wondered how my rich dad could acquire an asset so big even though he had very little. So after asking him how he did it, he gave me what he called the 90/10 riddle." "The 90/10 riddle," replied one of the students. "What is the 90/10 riddle, and what does it have to do with my investment plan?" With that question, I walked to the chalkboard and drew the following diagram. "This is the 90/10 riddle," I said. "That's the 90/10 riddle?" asked the student. "All it looks like is a financial statement without any assets in it." "And it is. So this is the question that completes the riddle," I said with a grin, watching the students' faces to see if they were still with me. After a long pause on my part, one of the students finally demanded, "So give us the question." "The question is," I said slowly, "how do you fill your asset column without buying any assets?" "Without buying any assets?" asked the student. "You mean without any money?" "More or less," I replied. "Your investment plan for putting $20,000 a year aside to invest is a good idea. But my challenge to you is the idea of buying assets with money a 90/10 idea, or is it an average investor idea?" "So you're saying to create assets in the asset column instead of buying the assets with money, which is what most people do." I nodded my head. "You see, this diagram, the diagram I call the 90/10 riddle, is the riddle that my rich dad would challenge me with on a regular basis. He would ask me for my ideas on how I could create assets in the asset column without buying them with money." The students were silent, looking at the riddle on the chalkboard. Finally one student turned and said, "Is that why you often say, it doesn't take money to make money?" I nodded my head and replied, "You're catching on. Most people in the 90% who own the 10% often say, it takes money to make money. Many often give up on investing if they do not have any money. So your rich dad's 90/10 riddle was to give you a blank asset column and ask you how you would fill it with assets without having to buy the assets. Constantly. After I came back from Vietnam, he would routinely have a lunch or dinner with me and ask me for new ideas on how to fill the asset column by creating assets instead of buying assets. He knew that is how many of the ultra-rich got rich in the first place. That is how Bill Gates, Michael Dell, and Richard Branson all became billionaires. They did not become billionaires by looking for a job and putting a few dollars aside. So you're saying the way to become rich is by being an entrepreneur? No, I am not saying that. I just use those examples because you are all in the entrepreneurship program at Thunderbird. The Beatles became ultra-rich by creating a different kind of asset, but they created assets that still produce money today. All I am saying is that Rich Dad put this financial statement with a blank asset column in front of me on a regular basis and asked me how I would create assets inside the asset column without having to spend money to acquire them. He began giving me this 90-tenths quiz when I asked him how he found the power to acquire a piece of the most expensive beachfront land without any money. So he said his business bought the land, another student chimed in. As I said, that is one way, but there are many ways you can create assets inside an asset column without buying them. Inventors do it by inventing something of great value. Artists paint paintings that are priceless. Authors write books that pay them royalties for years. Creating a business is the way an entrepreneur does it, but you don't have to be an entrepreneur to create an asset inside the asset column. I've done it with real estate without using any money. All you have to do is be creative, and you can be rich for life. You mean I can invent something with new technology and become rich? Asked one of the students. You could, but it does not have to be an invention or new technology, I said, pausing for a while. It is a way of thinking that creates assets. Once you have that way of thinking, you will be richer than you ever dreamed possible. What do you mean it doesn't have to be a new invention or technology? What else could it be? Doing my best to make my point, I asked, do you remember the story about the comic books in my book, Rich Dad Poor Dad? Yes, said one of the students. The story of your rich dad taking away your 10 cents an hour and asking you to work for free after you asked for a raise. He took away the 10 cents because he did not want you to spend your life working for money. Yes, that story, I replied. That is a story about filling the asset column with an asset without buying the asset. The students stood quietly for a while thinking about what I had just said. Finally one spoke up and said, so you took old comic books and turned them into assets. I nodded my head. But were the comic books the asset? I asked. Not until you turned them into an asset, replied another student. You took something that was being thrown out as trash and turned it into an asset. Yes, but were the comic books the asset, or were the comic books merely the part of the asset you could see? Oh, another one of the students jumped in. It was the invisible thought process that took the comic book and created an asset out of it. The thought process was the real asset. That is how my rich dad saw it. He later told me that the power he had was his thinking process. It was a thinking process that he often jokingly called, turning trash into cash. He also said, most people do exactly the opposite and turn cash into trash. That is why the 90-tenths rule holds true. He was like the ancient alchemists, said one of the students, the alchemists who searched for the formula to turn lead into gold. Exactly, I said. The people who are in the 90-tenths grouping of money are modern-day alchemists. The only difference is that they are able to turn nothing into assets. Their power is the ability to take ideas and turn them into assets. But as you say, many people have great ideas. They are just not able to convert them into assets, said a student. I nodded my head, and that was my rich dad's secret power that I saw that day on the beach. It was that mental power or financial intelligence that allowed him to acquire such an expensive piece of real estate, while the average investor would walk away from it, saying, I can't afford it, or, it takes money to make money. How often did he give you the 90-tenths quiz? Asked a student. Very often, I replied. It was his way of exercising my brain. Rich Dad often said that our brains are our most powerful asset and, if used improperly, they can be our most powerful liability. The students were silent. I assumed they were contemplating and questioning their own thoughts. Finally the original student, the student whose plan it was to put the $20,000 a year away, said, so that is why in your book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, one of Rich Dad's lessons was that the rich invent their own money. I nodded my head and said, and lesson number 1 of the 6 lessons was, the rich don't work for money. Again there was silence from the young students before one said, "So while we are planning on getting a job and saving money to buy assets, you were taught that your job was to create assets." "Well said," I replied. "You see, the idea of a job was created in the industrial age, and ever since 1989, we have been in the information age." "What do you mean the idea of a job is an industrial age idea?" one student asked with a start. "Humans have always had jobs, haven't they?" "No, at least not in the way we know a job today. You see, in the hunter-gatherer period of humanity, humans lived in tribes and each person's job was to contribute to the communal survival of the tribe. In other words, it was all for one and one for all. Then came the agrarian age, the era when there were kings and queens. A person's job during that period was to be a serf or a peasant who paid the king to work the land the king owned. Then came the industrial age, and serfdom or slavery was abolished and human beings began selling their labor on the open market. Most people became employees or self-employed, doing their best to sell their labor to the highest bidder. That is the modern concept of the word job. So the moment I said I'm going to get a job and put $20,000 away a year, you see that kind of thinking is industrial age thinking. I nodded my head. Just as today there are still agrarian age workers who are known as farmers and ranchers. Today there are still hunter-gatherers, commercial fishermen, for example. Most people are working with industrial age ideas, and that is why so many people have jobs. "So what would an information age idea of work be?" asked a student. "People who do not work because their ideas are at work." Today there are students who are much like my rich dad who are going from school to becoming rich without a job. Look at many of the internet billionaires. Some of them dropped out of college to become billionaires without ever having a formal job. In other words, they started with an empty asset column and filled it with a very big asset, an information age asset, added one of the students. "Many built multi-billion-dollar assets," I said. "They went from students to billionaires. Soon there will be high school students who will go from high school students to billionaires without ever applying for a job. I already know of one who is a millionaire without ever having a job. After reading my book and playing my games, he bought a large piece of real estate, sold off a section of vacant land, kept the apartment house, and paid off his loan with the money from the land. He now owns the apartment house, which is worth a little over $1 million, and has cash flow of $4,000 a month income without working. He will graduate from high school in about a year." The students stood silently again, thinking about what I just said. Some had a hard time believing my story about the high school student, yet they knew the story of college dropouts becoming billionaires was true. Finally one spoke up. "So in the information age, people are getting rich with information." "Not just in the information age," I replied. "It has been this way throughout the ages. It is the people who do not have assets who work for, or are controlled by, those people who create, acquire, or control the assets." "So you're saying a high school kid could beat me financially, even though he does not have a great education from a prestigious school or a high-paying job," said the first student. "That is exactly what I am saying. It's more about the way you think than about your education." Best-selling author Thomas Stanley states in his book, The Millionaire Mind, that his research found no correlation between high SAT scores, good grades, and money. The student with the $20,000 a year investment plan then said, "So if I want to join the 90/10 Investor Club, I am better off to practice creating assets instead of buying assets. I should acquire assets by being creative rather than by doing what everyone else does." That is why billionaire Henry Ford said, "Thinking is the hardest work there is." "That is why so few people engage in it," I replied. It also explains why, if you do what the 90% of investors do, you will join them in sharing only 10% of the wealth. Or why Einstein said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge," added another student. Or why my rich dad gave me this tip when hiring an accountant. He said that when you're interviewing an accountant, ask him or her, "What is 1 plus 1? If the accountant answers 3, don't hire the person. They're not smart. If the accountant answers 2, you also don't hire them because they are not smart enough. But if the accountant answers, "What do you want 1 plus 1 to be?" you hire them immediately." The students laughed as we began packing up our materials. "So you create assets that buy other assets and liabilities. Is that correct?" asked a student. I nodded my head. "Do you ever use money to buy other assets?" asked the same student. Yes, but I like to use the money generated by the asset I create to buy other assets, I replied, picking up my briefcase. Remember that I don't like working for money. I'd rather create assets that buy other assets and liabilities. A young student from China gave me a hand with my bags and said, "And is that why you recommend network marketing so much? For very little money and risk, a person can build an asset in their spare time." I nodded my head, an asset they can pass on to their kids if their kids want it. I don't know of too many companies that will let you pass on your job to your kids. That is one test of an asset. You can hand it on down to the people you love. My dad, the man I call my poor dad, worked very hard to climb the government ladder. Even if he had not been fired, he would not have been able to pass on his years of hard work to his kids, not that any of us wanted the job or were qualified to take the job anyway. The students gave me a handout to my car. So think about creating assets rather than working hard and buying assets, said the $20,000 student. If you want to get into the 90/10ths Investor Club, I replied. That is why my rich dad constantly challenged my creativity to create different types of assets in the asset column without buying them. He said it was better to work years at creating an asset rather than to spend your life working hard for money to create someone else's asset. As I climbed into my car, the $20,000 student then said, "So all I have to do is take an idea and create an asset, a big asset, that makes me rich. If I do that, I will solve the 90/10ths riddle and join the 10% of all investors who control 90% of the wealth." Laughing, I pulled my door shut and replied to his last comment, "If you solve the 90/10ths riddle in real life, you will have a good chance of joining the 10% that control 90% of the money. If you don't solve the 90/10ths riddle in real life, you will probably join the 90% that control just 10% of the money." I thanked the students and drove away. Mental attitude quiz. As Henry Ford said, thinking is the hardest work there is. That is why so few people engage in it. Or as my rich dad said, your brain can be your most powerful asset. But if not used properly, it can be your most powerful liability. My rich dad had me repeatedly create new assets in an empty asset column. He would sit down with his son and me and ask us how we could create a new and different asset. He really did not care if the idea was crazy. He just wanted us to be able to substantiate how our idea could be turned into an asset. He would ask us to defend our thoughts and challenge his challenges. In the long run, it was a lot better than him telling us to work hard, save money, and live below our means, which was what my poor dad recommended. So the mental attitude quiz question is, are you willing to consider creating your own assets rather than buying them? Yes_no_. There are many books and educational programs written on how to buy assets wisely. For most people, buying assets is the best plan for them. I would also recommend that you buy assets for the secure and comfortable levels of your investment plan. Invest in such assets as blue chip stocks for the secure and comfortable level. But if you have dreams of becoming a very rich investor, the question is, are you willing to create your assets rather than buy someone else's assets? If not, then as I said, there are many books and educational programs about how to purchase assets. If you are willing to consider how to create assets, then the remainder of this book will be valuable, maybe priceless. It is about how to take an idea and turn it into an asset that will acquire other assets. It is not only about how to make a lot of money in the asset column. It is also about how to keep the money that asset makes and have it acquire even more assets, as well as the luxuries of life. It reveals how many of the 10% came to acquire 90% of the money. So if this is of interest to you, then please read on. Again, this is the 90/10ths riddle. The riddle is, how do you create an asset in the asset column without spending money to acquire it? The smart way to keep your money. My first big business was the nylon and Velcro surfer wallet business in 1977. It was created as a very big asset in the asset column. The problem was that the size of the created asset was big, but my business skills were small. So while I was technically a millionaire in my 20s, I also lost it all in my 20s. I repeated the same process 3 years later in the rock and roll business. When MTV hit, our little company was in the perfect position to capitalize on the craze. Again, the asset created was bigger than the people who created it. We went up like a rocket ship and came down like a rocket ship without gas. The rest of this book is dedicated to creating big assets, having the professional talent to match the size of the asset, and keeping the money made by investing in other, often more stable, assets. As my rich dad said, what good is making a lot of money if you don't keep it? Investing is the way smart people keep their money. Phase 2. What type of investor do you want to become? Chapter 20. Solving the 90/10 riddle. My rich dad said, there are investors who buy assets, and there are investors who create assets. If you want to solve the 90/10 riddle for yourself, you need to be both types of investors. In the introduction, I told the story of Rich Dad walking along a beach with Mike and me, looking at a very expensive piece of beachfront real estate he had just purchased. You may recall that I asked Rich Dad how he could afford such an expensive piece of real estate when my poor dad could not. Rich Dad's reply was, I can't afford to buy this land either, but my business can. All I could see was a piece of land with old abandoned cars, an old building falling down, lots of brush and debris, and a large, for sale, sign sticking up from the middle of the property. At the age of 12, I could not see any business on this land, but my rich dad could. The business was being created in his head. That ability to create businesses in his head was the reason he would go on to be one of the richest men in Hawaii. In other words, Rich Dad solved his 90/10 riddle by creating assets that in turn purchased other assets. That plan was not only Rich Dad's investment plan. It is the investment plan for most of the 10% who make 90% of the money, in the past, in the present, and into the future. For those of you who read Rich Dad Poor Dad, you may recall the story of Ray Kroc saying to my friend's MBA class that McDonald's, the company he founded, was not in the business of hamburgers. Their business was the business of real estate. Again, the formula is to create an asset that buys other assets. That formula is the reason why McDonald's owns the most expensive real estate in the world. It was all part of the plan. And that is why Rich Dad repeatedly said to me, once he knew I was serious about becoming rich, if you want to solve the 90/10 riddle for yourself, you need to be both types of investors. You need to be a person who knows how to create assets, as well as a person who knows how to buy assets. The average investor is not generally aware of the different processes and is not good at either process of investing. The average investor usually does not even have a formally written plan. Making millions, maybe billions, from your ideas. Much of the second half of this book is about how people create assets. Rich Dad spent many hours with me teaching me the process of how a person takes an idea and turns it into a business that creates assets that buy other assets. During one of these lessons with Rich Dad, he said, many people have ideas that could make them rich beyond their wildest dreams. The problem is that most people have never been taught how to put a business structure inside their ideas, and so many of their ideas never take shape or stand on their own. If you want to be one of the 10% who make 90% of the money, you will need to know how to build a business structure inside your creative ideas. Much of the second half of this book is about what Rich Dad called the BI triangle, which is the mental structure that can give life to your financial ideas. It is the power of the BI triangle that takes an idea and turns it into an asset. Rich Dad often said, more than just knowing how to create assets that buy assets, one of the main reasons the richest of investors are able to become richer is that they know how to turn their ideas into millions and maybe even billions of dollars. The average investor may have excellent ideas, but they often lack the skills to turn their ideas into assets that buy assets. The remainder of this book is dedicated to how ordinary people are able to turn their ideas into assets that buy assets. You can't do that. While teaching me how to turn my ideas into assets, Rich Dad often said, when you first set out to turn your ideas into your personal fortune, many people will say, you can't do that. Always remember that nothing kills your great ideas more than people with small ideas and limited imaginations. Rich Dad gave me 2 reasons he thought people tended to say, you can't do that. 1. They say, you can't do that, even if you are doing what they say you cannot do, not because you can't do it, but because they can't do it. 2. They say, you can't do it, because they cannot see what you are doing. Rich Dad explained that the process of making a lot of money is a mental process more than a physical process. One of Rich Dad's favorite quotes came from Einstein, great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds. Commenting on Einstein's quote, Rich Dad said, we all possess both a great spirit and a mediocre mind. The challenge in turning our ideas into $1 million or even $1 billion asset is often the battle between our own great spirits and our own often mediocre minds. When I explain the BI triangle, which is the business structure that gives life to business ideas and is explained in this part of this book, some people become overwhelmed by the amount of knowledge required to make the BI triangle work for them. When that happens, I often remind them of the battle between their great spirits and mediocre minds. Whenever a person's mediocre mind begins to oppose their own great spirits, I always remind them of what my rich dad said to me. He said, "There are many people with great ideas, but very few people with great amounts of money." The reason the 90/10 rule holds true is that it does not take a great idea to become rich, but it does take a great person behind the idea to become rich. You must be of strong spirit and strong in your convictions to turn your ideas into fortunes. Even if you understand the process via which your ideas can become millions or even billions of dollars, always remember that great ideas only become great fortunes if the person behind the idea is also willing to be great. It is often difficult to keep going when everyone around you is saying, "You can't do it." You must have a very strong spirit to withstand the doubt of those around you. But your spirit must be even stronger when you are the person saying to yourself, "You can't do that." This does not mean that you plow blindly on, not listening to the good and bad ideas of your friends or yourself. Their thoughts and input should be listened to and often used when their ideas are better than yours. But at this moment, I am not talking to you about mere ideas or advice. What I am talking to you about is more than just ideas. I am talking about your spirit and the will to go on even when filled with doubt and when you're out of good ideas. No one can tell you what you can or cannot do in your life. Only you can determine that. Your own greatness is often found at the end of the road. And when it comes to turning your ideas into money, there are many times when you come to the end of the road. The end of the road is when you are out of ideas, out of money, and filled with doubt. If you can find in yourself the spirit to go on, you will find out what it really takes to turn your ideas into great assets. Turning an idea into a great fortune is more a matter of human spirit rather than a matter of the human mind. At the end of every road, the entrepreneur finds his or her spirit. Finding your entrepreneurial spirit and making it strong are more important than the idea or business you are developing. Once you find your entrepreneurial spirit, you will forever be able to take very ordinary ideas and turn them into extraordinary fortunes. Always remember that the world is filled with people with great ideas but very few people with great fortunes. The remainder of this book is dedicated to your finding your entrepreneurial spirit and developing your ability to turn ordinary ideas into extraordinary fortunes. Phase 2 gives you insight into Rich Dad's different types of investors and allows you to choose the path that may be best for you. Phase 3 analyzes Rich Dad's BI triangle and how it can provide the structure for you to make an asset out of your idea. Phase 4 goes into the mind of sophisticated investors and how they analyze investments. 7. How to get rich slowly. Rich Dad would regularly review the various levels of investors with me. He wanted me to understand the various ways investors made their fortunes. My rich dad had become wealthy by first investing as an inside investor. He had started small and learned the tax advantages available to him. He quickly gained confidence and became a truly sophisticated investor at an early age. He had built an incredible financial empire. My real dad, on the other hand, had worked hard all his life as a government employee and had little to show for it. As I got older, the gap between my rich dad and my poor dad was increasingly evident. I finally asked my rich dad why he was becoming wealthier while my real dad was working harder and harder. In the introduction of this book, I related the story of walking along the beach with my rich dad, looking at the large piece of oceanfront property he had just purchased. During that walk on the beach, I realized that my rich dad had just purchased an investment that only a rich person could acquire. The problem was that my rich dad was not really a rich man yet. That is why I asked him how he could afford such an expensive investment when I knew my real dad, a man who made more money than my rich dad, could not. It was during this walk on the beach that my rich dad shared the basis of his investment plan. He said, "I can't afford to buy this land either, but my business can." As I stated in the introduction, this was when my curiosity about the power of investing began and when I became a student of the profession. During that walk on the beach at the age of 12, I was beginning to learn the secrets of how many of the very richest people in the world invest and why they are the 10% who control 90% of the money. Again, I refer to Ray Kroc, founder of McDonald's, who said virtually the same thing to my friend's MBA class. Ray Kroc said to the class, "My business is not hamburgers. My business is real estate." That is why McDonald's owns the most valuable real estate in the world. Ray Kroc and Rich Dad understood that the purpose of a business is to buy assets. Rich Dad's investment plan. When I was a young boy still in elementary school, Rich Dad was already placing ideas in my head about the differences between being rich, poor, and middle class. During one of our Saturday lessons, he said, if you want job security, follow your dad's advice. If you want to be rich, you need to follow my advice. The chances of your dad having both job security and becoming rich are slim. The laws are not written in his favor. One of Rich Dad's 6 lessons described in Rich Dad Poor Dad was a lesson about the power of corporations. In Cash Flow Quadrant, I wrote about how the different quadrants were governed by different tax laws. Rich Dad used these lessons to show me the difference between his investment plan and my real dad's investment plan. These differences greatly affected my life's path after my formal education was complete and my military duty was over. My business buys assets with pre-tax dollars, said Rich Dad as he drew the following diagram. Your dad tries to buy assets with after-tax dollars. His financial statement looks like this, said Rich Dad. Your dad. As a young boy, I really did not fully comprehend what Rich Dad was trying to teach me, yet I recognized the difference. Because I was confused, I spent much time quizzing him on what it meant. To help me understand a little better, he drew the following diagram. Why? I asked Rich Dad. Why do you pay your taxes last, and why does my dad pay his taxes first? Because your dad is an employee and I am a business owner, said Rich Dad. Always remember that we may live in a free country, but everybody does not live by the same laws. If you want to be rich, you had best follow the same laws the rich use. How much in taxes does my dad pay? I asked. Well, your dad is a highly paid government employee, so I estimate that he pays at least 50% to 60% of his total income in taxes in one form or another, said Rich Dad. And how much do you pay in taxes? I asked. Well, that is not really the correct question, said Rich Dad. The real question is, how much is my taxable income? I became confused and asked, what is the difference? Well, said Rich Dad, I pay taxes on net income, and your dad's taxes are withheld from his total income. That is one of the biggest differences between your dad and me. I get ahead faster because I get to buy my assets with gross income and pay taxes on net income. Your dad pays taxes on gross income and then tries to buy assets with his net income. That is why it is very, very hard for him to achieve any kind of wealth. He gives a lot of his money to the government first, money that he could be using to buy assets. I pay my taxes on the net, or what is left over, after I buy my assets. I buy assets first and pay taxes last. Your dad pays taxes first and has very little money left over to buy assets with. At the age of 10 or 11, I really did not understand exactly what Rich Dad was saying. I just knew it did not sound fair and I said so. That is not fair, I protested. I agree, said Rich Dad, nodding. It isn't fair, but that is the law. The laws are the same. When discussing this issue in my seminars, I often hear, that may be a law in the United States, but that is not the law in my country. Since I teach in many English-speaking countries, I often reply with, how do you know? What makes you think the laws are different? The fact is that most people do not know which laws are similar and which laws are different, so I offer a short lesson in economic history and laws. I point out to my classes that most English-speaking countries' laws are based upon English common law, the law spread throughout the world by the British East India Company. I also point out to them the date the rich began to make the rules. In 1215, the Magna Carta, the most famous document of British constitutional history, was signed. By signing the Magna Carta, King John yielded part of his power to the rich barons of England. It is now generally recognized that the Magna Carta showed the viability of opposition to the excessive use of royal power. I then explained the importance of the Magna Carta as my rich dad explained it to me. Ever since the signing of the Magna Carta, the rich have been making the rules. The spiritual golden rule is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The financial golden rule is, he who has the gold makes the rules. However, I think the real financial golden rule is, he who makes the rules gets the gold. Your business buys your assets. When I was 25 and almost out of the Marine Corps, Rich Dad reminded me of the difference in 2 life paths. He said, this is how your dad tries to invest and acquire assets. He added, this is how I invest. Always remember that the rules are different for the different quadrants. Therefore, make your next career decision carefully. While that job with the airlines might be fun in the short term, in the long run, you might not get to be as rich as you want to be, he said. How the tax laws changed. Although Rich Dad did not finish school, he was an avid student of economics, world history, and the law. When I was attending the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy at Kings Point, New York, studying world trade, Rich Dad was very excited that my studies included admiralty law, business law, economics, and corporate law. Because I had studied these subjects, it was much easier for me to decide to not take a job as an airline pilot. The reason is found in history. One of the differences between America and the rest of the world colonized by the English is that the colonists in America protested excessive taxes by organizing the Boston Tea Party. America grew rapidly from the 1800s to the 1900s simply because we were a low-tax country. Being a low-tax haven, the United States attracted entrepreneurs from all over the world who wanted to get rich quickly. In 1913, however, we passed the 16th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution which made taxation of the rich possible, and that was the end of the low-tax state. Yet the rich have always found a way out of the trap, which is why the laws are different for the different quadrants, especially favoring the B quadrant, the quadrant of the ultra-rich of America. The rich have gotten even for the tax law change of 1913 by slowly changing the laws and putting the pressure back on the other quadrants. So the slow creep of taxation looks like this. In 1943, the Current Tax Payment Act was passed. Now, instead of just taxing the rich, the federal government was allowed to tax everyone in the E quadrant. If you were an employee in the E quadrant, you could no longer pay yourself first because the government got paid first. People are always shocked to see how much is taken out in both direct taxes and in hidden taxes from their paycheck. In 1986, the Tax Reform Act was passed. This law change dramatically affected anyone who was a professional worker, people such as doctors, lawyers, accountants, architects, engineers, and so on. This law change prevented someone in the S quadrant from using the same tax laws used by the B quadrant. For example, if a person in the S quadrant has the same income as someone in the B quadrant, the S quadrant worker will have to pay a beginning tax rate of 35%, 50% when you include social insurance taxes. On the other hand, the B quadrant person could possibly pay 0% on the same amount of income. In other words, the golden rule, he who makes the rules keeps the gold, was once again true. The rules are made from the B quadrant and have been made from there ever since 1215 when the barons forced the king to sign the Magna Carta. Some of these laws and changes are explained in greater detail in Rich Dad Poor Dad and in Cash Flow Quadrant. The decision is made. Even after I decided to follow Rich Dad's investment plan instead of my Poor Dad's plan, Rich Dad shared with me a simple analysis about my chances for success in life that reinforced my decision. Drawing the cash flow quadrant, he said, your first decision is to figure out in which quadrant you have the most chance of achieving long-term financial success. Pointing to the E quadrant, he said, you don't have the expertise that employers will pay the big money for, so you'll probably never make enough money as an employee to invest with. Besides, you're sloppy, you get bored easily, you don't have a very long attention span, you tend to argue, and you don't follow instructions well. Therefore, your chances for financial success in the E quadrant don't look very good. Pointing to the S quadrant, he said, S stands for smart. That is why so many doctors, lawyers, accountants, and engineers are in the S quadrant. You're bright, but you're not that smart. You were never much of a student. The S also stands for star. You'll probably never be a rock star, movie star, or sports star, so your chances of making the big money in the S quadrant are slim. That leaves the B quadrant, Rich Dad continued. This quadrant is perfect for you. Since you lack any special talent or expertise, your chances for attaining great wealth will be in this quadrant. And with that comment, I was certain. I decided that my best chance for great wealth and financial success would be through building a business. The tax laws were in my favor, and my lack of stardom in the other quadrants just made my decision easier. Lessons in hindsight. I try to pass along the bits of wisdom I learned from my Rich Dad. When I am asked how I invest, I usually tell the group about investing through a business, or as Rich Dad said, my business buys my assets. Invariably, people raise their hands and say things such as, but I am an employee, and I do not own my own business. Not everyone can own a business. Starting a business is risky. I don't have any money to invest. To these types of responses to Rich Dad's investment plan, I offer these ideas. To the statement that, not everyone can own a business, I remind people that less than 100 years ago, most people did own their own businesses. Just 100 years ago, approximately 85% of the US population was either independent farmers or small shopkeepers. I know that both sets of my grandparents were small business owners. Only a small percentage of the population was comprised of employees. I then say, it seems that the industrial age, with its promise of high-paying jobs, job security for life, and pension benefits, has bred that independence out of us. I also add that our educational system was designed to create employees and professional people, not entrepreneurs, so it would be only natural for people to feel that starting a business would be risky. The points I make are: 1. Chances are that you all have the potential to be great business owners if you have the desire to develop the skills. Our ancestors developed and depended upon their entrepreneurial skills. If you do not have a business today, the question is, do you want to go through the process of learning how to build a business? You are the only one who can answer that question. 2. When people say, I have no money to invest, or, I need a real estate deal I can buy for no money down, I reply, maybe you should switch quadrants and invest from the quadrant that allows you to invest with pre-tax dollars. Then you might have a lot more money to invest. One of the first considerations in your investment plan should be to decide in which quadrant lies the best opportunity for you to make the most money quickly. That way, you can begin investing for the highest returns, with the least risk, and you'll have the best chance of becoming very, very rich. Chapter 28. Keep your day job and still become rich. Once I decided to build a business, the next problem facing me was that I had no money. First, I did not know how to build a business. Second, I had no money to build a business with, and third, I had no money to live on. Feeling weak in the stomach and lacking confidence in myself, I called Rich Dad and asked him what I should do. He immediately said, go get a job. His reply shocked me. I thought you were telling me to start my own business. Yes, I did. But you still have to eat and put a roof over your head, he said. I have shared with countless people what he said to me next. Rule number 1 in becoming an entrepreneur is to never take a job for money. Take a job only for the long-term skills you will learn. The first and only job I got after the Marine Corps was with the Xerox Corporation. I chose it because it had the best sales training program. Rich Dad knew I was very shy and terrified of rejection. He recommended I learn to sell, not for the money, but to learn to overcome my personal fears. Each day, I had to go from office building to office building knocking on doors trying to sell people a Xerox machine. It was a very painful learning process, yet this process has made me millions of dollars over the years. Rich Dad would say, if you cannot sell, you cannot be an entrepreneur. For 2 years, I was the worst salesperson in the Honolulu branch. I took extra classes on selling, bought tapes and listened to them. Finally, after nearly being fired several times, I began to make sales. Although I was still painfully shy, the sales training helped me to develop the skills I needed to acquire wealth. The problem was that no matter how hard I worked and how many machines I sold, I was always short of cash. I had no money with which to invest or to start a business. One day I told Rich Dad that I planned to take a part-time job to supplement my income so I could invest. That was the moment he had been waiting for. Rich Dad said, the biggest mistake people make is that they work too hard for their money. He went on, saying, most people do not get ahead financially because when they need more money, they take a part-time job. If they really want to get ahead, they need to keep their day job and start a part-time business. Rich Dad drew this diagram for me once he knew I was learning valuable skills and was serious about becoming a business owner and investor. It is time for you to start your business, part-time, he said. Don't waste your time with a part-time job. A part-time job keeps you in the E quadrant, but a part-time business moves you towards the B quadrant. Most big companies are started as part-time businesses. In 1977, I started my nylon and Velcro wallet business part-time. Many of you are familiar with that product line today. From 1977 to 1978, I worked very hard at Xerox, eventually becoming one of the top sales representatives in the branch. In my spare time, I was also building a business that would soon become a worldwide, multi-million-dollar business. When people asked me if I loved my product line, a line that consisted of colorful nylon wallets, nylon watch bands, and nylon shoe pockets that attached to the laces of a running shoe and held a key, money, and ID card, I answer, no. I was not in love with the product line. But I did enjoy the challenge of building the business. I mention this point specifically because so many people tell me such things as 1. I have a great idea for a new product. 2. You have to feel passionate about your product. 3. I'm looking for the right product before I begin my business. To these people, I generally say, the world is filled with great ideas for new products. The world is also filled with great products. But the world is short of great business people. The primary reason to start a business part-time is not so much to make a great product. The real reason for starting a part-time business is to make yourself a great business person. Great products are a dime a dozen. But great business people are rare and rich. If you look at Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, he did not even invent his software product. He bought it from a group of computer programmers and then went on to build one of the most powerful and influential companies in world history. Gates did not build a great product, but he did build a great business that helped him become the richest man in the world. Do not bother trying to make a great product. Focus more on starting a business so you can learn to become a great business owner. Michael Dell of Dell Computers started his part-time business in his dormitory at the University of Texas. He had to quit school because his part-time business was making him far richer than any job he was studying for. Jeff Bezos started Amazon.com in a garage on a part-time basis. That young man is a billionaire today. Lessons in hindsight. Many people dream of starting their own business but never do because they're afraid of failing. Many other people dream of becoming rich but don't because they lack the skills and experience. The business skill and experience is where money really comes from. Rich Dad said to me, the education you receive in school is important, but the education you receive on the street is even better. Starting a business at home part-time allows you to learn priceless business skills and subjects such as 1. Communication skills. 2. Leadership skills. 3. Team building skills. 4. Tax law. 5. Corporate law. 6. Securities law. These skills and subjects cannot be learned in a weekend course or in a single book. I continue to study them today. The more I study them, the more my businesses improve. One reason people learn so much by starting a part-time business is that they start as insiders in their own business. If someone can learn to build businesses, a whole new world with virtually unlimited financial opportunity becomes available. One of the problems with being in the E quadrant or the S quadrant, however, is that the opportunities are often limited by how hard one person can work and how many hours there are in a day. Chapter 29. The Entrepreneurial Spirit. People invest for two basic reasons. 1. To save for retirement. 2. To make a lot of money. While most of us invest for both reasons, and both are important, it seems that the majority of people lean more toward the first reason. They put money away as savers and hope it will increase in value over time. They invest, but they are more concerned about losing than winning. I have met many people whose fear of losing prevents them from acting. People need to be true to their emotional senses when investing. If the pain and the fear of losing are too great, it is best for that investor to invest very conservatively. Yet if you look at the great wealth of this world, that wealth has not come from cautious investors. The great changes in this world have come from investors backing what my rich dad called the entrepreneurial spirit. One of my favorite stories is that of Christopher Columbus, a brave Italian explorer who believed the world was round and who had a bold plan to find a faster route to the riches of Asia. However, the popular belief of his day was that the world was flat. Everyone thought that Columbus would sail off the edge of the earth if he attempted his plan. In order to test his theory that the world was round, Columbus had to go to the royalty of Spain and convince them to invest in his business venture. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella put up what is called the front money and invested in his business venture. My history teacher in school tried to tell me that the money was raised to further knowledge via exploration. My rich dad told me that it was purely a business venture that needed capital. The king and queen knew that if this entrepreneur named Columbus succeeded in sailing west to reach the east, they would earn a high return on their investment. Columbus and the king and queen who backed him all had the true spirit of the entrepreneur. The king and queen did not invest to lose money. They invested because they wanted to make more money. It was the spirit of venturing or risk with the possibility of great reward. They invested in that spirit. Why start a business? As I began to formulate my plans to start my part-time business, Rich Dad was adamant about the spirit with which I undertook this new adventure, the adventure of building a worldwide business. He said, "You build a business because of the challenge. You build a business because it is exciting, it's challenging, and it will require everything you've got to make it successful." Rich Dad wanted me to start a business in order to find my entrepreneurial spirit. He often said, "The world is filled with people with great ideas, but only a few people with great fortunes from their ideas." So he encouraged me to start a business, any business. He did not care about what the product was or how much I liked the product. He was not concerned about my failing. He just wanted me to start. Today I see so many people with great ideas who are afraid to start, or they start, fail, and quit. That is why Rich Dad often quoted Einstein's saying, "Great spirits have always encountered violent opposition from mediocre minds." He wanted me to simply start any business just so that I could challenge my own mediocre mind and, in the process, develop my entrepreneurial spirit. Rich Dad would also say, "The main reason so many people buy assets rather than create them is that they have not called upon their own entrepreneurial spirit to take their ideas and turn those ideas into great fortunes. Don't do it for only $200,000. Going back to the definition of the accredited investor, Rich Dad said, "All a person needs to do to be an accredited investor is have a salary of $200,000. I often hear people say, "When I make a lot of money, my money problems will be over." In reality, new money problems would just be beginning. One of the reasons so many newly rich people suddenly go broke is because they use their old money habits to handle new money problems. In 1977, I started my first big business, which was my nylon and Velcro surfer wallet business. The asset created was bigger than the people who created it. I lost the asset. A few years later, I created another asset that grew rapidly, and again, the asset got bigger than the people who created it. Again I lost the asset. It took the third business for me to learn what my rich dad had been guiding me to learn. My poor dad was shocked at my financial ups and downs. He was a loving father, but it pained him to see me on top of the world one minute and in the gutter the next. But my rich dad was actually happy for me. He said after my two big creations and disasters, most millionaires lose 3 companies before they win big. It took you only 2 companies. The average person has never lost a business. That is why 10% of the people control 90% of money. After my stories about making millions and losing millions, I am often asked an important question: why do rich people go bankrupt? I offer some of the following possibilities, all from personal experience. Reason number 1. People who have grown up without money have no idea how to handle a lot of money. Too much money is often as big a problem as not enough money. If a person is not trained to handle large sums of money or does not have proper financial advisors, then chances are very strong that they will either stash the money away in the bank, or just lose it. As my rich dad said, money does not make you rich. In fact, money has the power to make you both rich and poor. There are billions of people each day who prove that fact. Most have some money, but they spend it only to get poorer or greater in debt. The problem again stems from people receiving money and then buying liabilities they think are assets. I am certain that in the next few years many of today's young millionaires will be in financial struggle because of their lack of money management skills. Reason number 2. When people come into money, the emotional euphoria is like a drug that boosts your spirits. My rich dad said, when the money high hits, people feel more intelligent, when in fact they are becoming more stupid. They think they own the world and immediately go out and start spending money like King Tut with tubes of gold. My tax strategist once said to me, I have been an advisor to many rich men. Just before they go broke after making a ton of money, they tend to do 3 things. 1. They buy a jet or big boat. 2. They go on a safari. And 3. They divorce their wife and marry a much younger woman. When I see that happening, I begin preparing for the crash. Again, much like reason number 1, they buy liabilities or divorce an asset, which then creates a liability. Then they marry a new liability. They now have 2 or more liabilities. Reason number 3. The hardest thing for many people is to say no to people they love when they ask to borrow money. This has not happened to me, but I have seen many families and friendships break up when one person suddenly becomes rich. As Rich Dad said, a very important skill in becoming rich is to develop the ability to say no to yourself and to the people you love. The people who come into money and begin buying boats and big houses are not able to say no to themselves, let alone their family members. They end up further in debt, just because they suddenly had a lot of money. Not only do people want to borrow money from you when you have money, but banks want to lend you more money. That is why people say, banks lend you money when you don't need it. If things go bad, not only do you have trouble collecting the loans you made to friends and relatives, but the banks then have trouble collecting from you. Reason number 4. The person with money suddenly becomes an investor, with money, but without education and experience. Again, this goes back to Rich Dad's statement that when people suddenly have money, they think their financial IQ went up also, when in fact it has gone down. When a person has money, they suddenly begin receiving phone calls from stockbrokers, real estate brokers, and investment brokers. Rich Dad also had a joke about brokers. The reason they are called brokers is that they are broker than you. My apologies to any brokers who were offended, but I think my Rich Dad's stockbroker is the one who told the joke to him originally. I had a friend of my family who came into a $350,000 inheritance. In less than 6 months, all that money was lost in the stock market, not to the market but to the broker that churned the suddenly rich person who believed that money made him more intelligent. For those who do not know what churning means, it is when the broker advises the person to buy and sell regularly, so the broker makes the commission on each buy and sell. This practice is frowned upon and severe fines are levied if brokerage houses find their brokers involved in this practice, yet it does happen. Just because you meet the qualifications of an accredited investor, simply a person with money, does not mean you know anything about investing. You will see many companies that invest as foolishly as individuals do. When there's a lot of money in the market, many companies run around buying other companies they hope are assets. In the industry, this is often called M&A, build a strong business. Chapter 30. Why build a business? Rich Dad said, there are 3 reasons for building a business other than to simply create an asset. 1. To provide excess cash flow. In his book, How to Be Rich, Paul Getty states that his first rule is that you must be in business for yourself. He goes on to imply that you will never get rich working for someone else. One of the primary reasons Rich Dad started so many businesses was that he had excess cash flow from his other businesses. He also had the time because his businesses required minimal effort on his part. This allowed him the free time and extra money to keep investing in more and more assets tax-free. That is why he became rich so quickly and why he said to mind your own business. 2. To sell it. The problem with having a job is that you cannot sell the job, regardless of how hard you work. The problem with building a business in the S quadrant is that there is usually a limited market that would want to buy it. For example, if a dentist builds a practice, generally the only other person who may want to buy it is another dentist. To Rich Dad, that was too narrow of a market. He said, for something to be valuable, there must be many more people than you who want it. The problem with an S quadrant business is that you are often the only person who wants it. Rich Dad said, an asset is something that puts money in your pocket, or it can be sold to someone else for more than you have paid or invested in it. If you can build a successful business, you will always have a lot of money. If you learn to build a successful business, you will have developed a profession that few people ever achieve. In 1975, while I was learning to sell Xerox machines, I came across a young man who owned 4 quick copy print shops in Honolulu. The reason he was in the business of making copies was interesting. While in school, he had run the university's copy shop and learned the business side of the operation. When he came out of school, there were no jobs, so he opened up a copy shop in downtown Honolulu doing what he knew best. Soon, he had 4 of these copy centers in 4 of the bigger downtown office buildings, all on long-term leases. A major copy shop chain came to town and made him an offer he could not refuse. He took their $750,000, a giant sum in those days, bought a boat, gave $500,000 to a professional money manager, and sailed around the world. When he returned a year and a half later, the manager had grown his investment to nearly $900,000, so the young man just sailed off again, back to the islands of the South Pacific. I was the guy who sold him the copy machines, and all I got was my small commission. He was the guy who built a business, sold it, and sailed away. I never saw him again after 1978, but I have heard that he pulls back into town every so often, checks his portfolio, and sails off again. My rich dad said, as a business owner, you don't have to be right 51% of the time. You need to be right only once. He also said, building a business is the riskiest road for most people. But if you can survive and keep improving your skills, your potential for wealth is unlimited. If you avoid risk and play it safe on the E&S side, you may be safer, but you'll also limit what you can truly earn. 3. To build a business and take it public. This was Rich Dad's idea of becoming what he called the ultimate investor. It was building a business and taking it public that made Bill Gates, Henry Ford, Warren Buffett, Ted Turner, and Anita Roddick very, very wealthy. They were the selling shareholders while we were all the buying shareholders. They were insiders, while we were outsiders trying to look in. You're never too old and you're never too young. If anyone tells you that you can't build a business that others want to buy, use that small-minded thought to inspire you. It is true that Gates was very young when he started Microsoft, but Colonel Sanders was 66 when he started Kentucky Fried Chicken. In the next few chapters, I will be describing what Rich Dad called the BI triangle. I use this triangle as a guide to building a business. It outlines the primary technical skills that are required. Rich Dad also felt certain personal traits were required to be a successful entrepreneur. Vision, the ability to see what others cannot see. Courage, the ability to act despite tremendous doubt. Creativity, the ability to think outside the box. The ability to withstand criticism. There is not one successful person who has not been criticized. The ability to delay gratification. It can be very difficult to learn to deny short-term, immediate self-gratification in favor of a greater long-term reward. Chapter 31. The BI Triangle. The Key to Great Wealth. Rich Dad called the following diagram, the BI Triangle, the key to great wealth. The BI Triangle was very important to Rich Dad because it gave structure to his ideas. As he often said, there are many people with great ideas but few people with great fortunes. The BI Triangle has the power to turn ordinary ideas into great fortunes. The BI Triangle is the guide to taking an idea and creating an asset. It represents the knowledge required to be successful on the B and I side of the cash flow quadrant. I have modified it a little over the years. I was about 16 years old when I first saw this diagram. Rich Dad drew it for me when I started asking him the following questions. 1. How is it that you have so many businesses and other people can barely handle one? 2. Why do your businesses grow while other people's businesses stay small? 3. How do you have free time when other business owners work constantly? 4. Why do so many businesses start and then fail so quickly? I did not ask him all these questions at the same time, yet they were questions that came to mind as I studied his businesses. Rich Dad was about 40 years old, and I was amazed at how he could run several different companies, all in different industries. For example, he had a restaurant business, a fast food business, a convenience store chain, a trucking company, a real estate construction business, and a property management business. I knew he was following his plan to have his businesses buy his true investments, which for him was real estate, but it was amazing how many businesses he could run all at the same time. When I asked him how he could start, own, and manage so many businesses, his response was to draw the BI triangle. Today, I own interests in several different companies in completely different businesses because I use the BI triangle as a guide. I do not own as many companies as Rich Dad did, but by following the same formula outlined in the BI triangle, I could own more if I wanted to. Explaining the BI triangle. Obviously, the amount of material that could be written, and needs to be written, to cover the information represented by the BI triangle is more than this book could cover. However, we will review the basics. Mission. Rich Dad said, a business needs both a spiritual and a business mission to be successful, especially at the beginning. When he explained this diagram to his son and me, he always began with the mission since he thought it to be the most important aspect of the triangle, which is why it was at the base. If the mission is clear and strong, the business will weather the trials every business goes through during its first 10 years. When a business gets big and it forgets its mission, or the mission it was created for is no longer needed, the business begins to die. Rich Dad chose the words, spiritual, and business. He said, many people start a business only to make money. Just to make money is not a strong enough mission. Money alone does not provide enough fire, drive, or desire. The mission of a business should fill a need that the customers want. And if it fills that need, and fills it well, the business will begin to make money. When it came to the spiritual component of the mission, Rich Dad said, Henry Ford was a man driven by a spiritual goal first, and a business goal second. He wanted to make the automobile available to the masses, not just the rich. That is why his mission statement was, democratize the automobile. When the spiritual mission and business mission are both strong and in line, the combined power builds huge businesses. Rich Dad's spiritual mission and business mission were closely in line. His spiritual mission was to provide jobs and opportunities for many of the poor people to whom he served food in his restaurants. Rich Dad thought the mission of a business was very important, although it was hard to see and to measure. He said, without a strong mission, a business is not likely to survive its first 5 to 10 years. He also said, at the start of a business, the mission and the entrepreneur's spirit are essential for the business to survive. The spirit and mission must be preserved long after the entrepreneur is gone, or the business will die. The mission of a business is a reflection of the spirit of the entrepreneur. General Electric was a company founded from the brilliance of Thomas Edison, and it has grown by preserving the spirit of the great inventor by continuing to invent new and innovative products. Ford Motor Company has survived by continuing in the tradition of Henry Ford. Today, I believe that Bill Gates' spirit continues to drive Microsoft to dominate the world of software. By contrast, when Steve Jobs was pushed out of Apple and a management team from the traditional corporate world replaced him, the company went downhill rapidly. As soon as Jobs was brought back into Apple, the spirit of the company rebounded, new products came forth, profitability increased, and the share price went up. Although the mission of a business is hard to measure,